The British author of the last century, H.G. Wells, once observed, "Every time I see an adult on a bicycle, I no longer despair for the future of the human race." On this day, November 20th, in the year 1902, a group of people sat down and began to plan what would become a renowned cycling event called the Tour de France. The reason for the creation of the Tour de France was not primarily athletic, was not because of a group of people's love of racing bikes. At the time in France, there were two sports newspapers that were bitter rivals, and one of them decided that in order to get more financial backers, in order to get more readers and to achieve greater popularity, they would begin this yearly bike race called the Tour de France. The first one was run in 1903, the following year. It lasted from May until July, and it was raced in several different stages. Now, the race created such great passion and such great interest and so many fans that the following year, 1904, there was widespread physical assault and fighting during it. There was a widespread cheating, so much so that many people thought the second Tour de France would be the last one. But despite all of those things, it continues to this day. It was canceled during the Second World War for obvious reasons, and this past year, with the pandemic, it was postponed until August. But fighting and cheating aside, I look at this picture of the first winner of the Tour de France, Msgr. His bike is decked out after winning, and I think of H.G. Wells' words, "Every time I see an adult on a bicycle, I no longer despair for the future of the human race." The cleansing of the temple, which we heard about in today's gospel, is found in all four of the gospels. Luke, as well as Matthew and Mark, place this event right before the Passion of Jesus begins. The author of the Gospel of John places this event at the beginning of his gospel. As Luke tells the event, and you read it, you begin to think, is Jesus now in a moment of despair for the human race? Does he feel a sense of hopelessness when he looks around at the moneylenders and the merchants? Now, we can see, scripture scholars tell us, this is simply a moment of rage and destruction, or we can see it as Jesus ushering in a dramatic new beginning. Jesus indeed looked around, and he had hope for the human race, not because they were riding bicycles, those didn't exist, but because he saw in them their ability to rise above struggle, to rise above hatred and conflict, to rise above selfishness, and to live as one human family. But in order to do that, Jesus always believed you have to clear away, sometimes quite dramatically, the things that prevent people from seeing and experiencing a sense of hope. You know, in the temple, when Jesus is clearing out those merchants and the animals and the moneylenders, he quotes the prophet Isaiah, and he says, "My house shall be a house of prayer." But it's interesting that when it's recorded in Luke's gospel, he leaves out three words in Isaiah's original quote. "My house shall be a house of prayer for all peoples." For all peoples. Now, there's not really a big reason as to why he leaves it out, because if you look at the entire Gospel of Luke, his entire message is one of showing Jesus who comes for all people, who comes for every human person, that they are all part of God's kingdom. Whether they're seen in the world as winners or losers, whether they have cheated, or whether they have truly lived according to God's law, all of them are invited to be part of the kingdom. What gratitude and maybe what great sense of blessing should we feel when we hear that, knowing that no matter where we are on this race of life, no matter where we are in the journey, God still looks at us and says there is a reason to have hope. The work of discipleship, then, is for all of us to clear away the things, again, sometimes dramatically, the things that prevent people from having hope, from experiencing that the kingdom is near and they're part of it in their lives. What is it exactly that gives you hope these days? When you look at the human family, sometimes it can be a little difficult. There can be much to despair of. But in these months of the pandemic, months that can seem very much like the Tour de France, with the various stages of the race, each stage coming with a challenge, what have you seen that has given you a sense of hope? You know, in the early months of the pandemic, I would sit here at the dining room table and do my work each day, and I would look out the window, which is right over here. I've mentioned this before. And in the beginning, it was really quiet out there. There was no one anywhere, no buses bringing kids to the schools, no cars going to work or going to the daily errands of life. There was not a soul. And then slowly you began to see people walking dogs, and then more people as the pandemic adoptions took place. But then I started to see people riding bikes, especially on some of those really nice days we had in the spring. People who were outfitted in gear and with really good-looking bikes that made you think maybe they are training for the Tour de France. And then others who it looked like they dragged that old bike out of the back of the garage and they just got on it because they wanted to be outside. I would look out and I would see people who were walking, people who were biking, people who were simply being grateful to be outside. And that would always and continues to give me hope for the human race. And still there are other moments, aren't there? Some of them you see on the internet or television. Many we experience in our daily life. People who at a moment when we perhaps feel despair, say something, do something, reveal something to us that makes us realize that God is indeed at work in the human family and that there is a reason to have hope. Thanksgiving is next week. For most of us, I suspect for all of us, it's going to be very different, isn't it? For me, my mother's house is going to be much quieter, without the usual huge, loud crowd of family and friends that gather around the table, that gather in the family room, that turn on some football game, that enjoy being with one another. This year, it's going to be just my mother and me. I feel no sadness about that. I feel no real disappointment about it. See, I think too much has happened in this past year, at least for me, to let that be a moment of disappointment, a moment of despair. It's what you and I have to do, right? It's the sacrifice that we're being called to make, not just as citizens, but as citizens of the kingdom, as followers of Jesus. The kind of cleansing that all of us need to do in order to make sure that we come through this difficult time safely and together. I see people making all kinds of sacrifices every day, doing what is right, doing what is needed. And I see the grace of God shining through them. That has filled these past months, at least for me, with a sense of hope, that I do not despair. Whether you're riding a bike, walking a dog, or just helping your neighbor in his or her need. As I think about the list of the things that I have seen, the people I've witnessed who have given me hope, I realize now that this Thanksgiving, more than any other Thanksgiving before, those moments I have seen will be one of many, many, for which I will be truly grateful.